please.
Mr. Hine.
Present.
Mrs. Appleby. Here. Mr. Hettinger.
Here.
Mr. Morris.
Here.
Mr. Munson.
Here.
Mr. Mikeworth. Here. And Mr. Glenn.
Here.
May I have a motion to approve the regular board minutes of April 17th of 2019?
So approved.
Mr. Glenn, second. Mr. Hettinger.
There's a motion on the floor by Mr. Glenn, seconded by Mr. Hettinger, to approve the minutes of the April 17, 2019 regular board meetings.
Discussion?
Sorry.
Roll call.
Mrs. Appleby.
Yes.
Mr. Hettinger.
Yes.
Mr. Morris.
I'll abstain if I'm here.
Okay. Mr. Munson.
Yes.
Mr. Mikeworth.
Yes.
Mr. Glenn.
Yes.
And Mr. Hine.
Yes.
There are no transfers or emergency appropriations. May I have a motion to approve the payments of the county's financial obligation?
So moved.
Mr. Morris,
Second.
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 Mr. Hahn.
There's a motion on the floor by Mr. Morris, seconded by Mr. Hine, to approve the payments of the county's financial obligations.
Discussion? Roll call, please.
Mr. Hettinger.
Yes.
Mr. Morris.
Yes.
Mr. Munson.
Yes.
Mr. Mikeworth.
Yes.
Mr. Glenn.
Yes.
Mr. Hine.
Yes.
And Mrs. Appleby.
Yes.
And may I have a motion to approve the reports of fees of the county offices?
Absolutely.
Mrs. Appleby, second.
Second.
Mr. Glenn, second.
There's a motion on the, excuse me, on the floor by Mrs. Appleby, seconded by Mr. Glenn, to approve the reports of fees of county offices.
Discussion? Roll call, please.
Mr. Morris.
Yes.
Mr. Munson.
Yes.
Mr. Mikeworth.
Yes.
Mr. Glenn.
Yes.
Mr. Hine.
Yes.
Mrs. Appleby.
Yes.
And Mr. Hettinger.
Yes.
Mr. Hettinger, would you present item 8, please?
Yes, sir. Mr. Chairman, I recommend the appointment of Mike Phillips to the Douglas County Merit Commission Board to fulfill the vacated position of Bob Utterback.
Is there a second?
I would second.
Mr. Glenn seconds.
There's a motion on the floor by Mr. Hettinger, seconded by Mr. Glenn, to appoint Mike Phillips to the Douglas County Merit Commission Board to fulfill the vacated position of Bob Utterback.
Discussion? Roll call, please.
Mr. Munson.
Yes.
Mr. Mikeworth.
Yes.
Mr. Glenn.
Yes.
Mr. Hine.
Yes.
Mrs. Appleby.
Yes.
Mr. Hettinger.
Yes.
And Mr. Morris.
Yes.
Mr. Glenn, would you present item 9, please?
Mr. Chairman, I'd like approval of a Douglas County liquor license as listed for a one-year term beginning May 1, 2019 till April 30th of 2020 for the TA Carbon Steakhouse and Bar, South Line Road, Tuscola.
Second?
Second.
Mr. Hahn.
There's a motion on the floor by Mr. Glenn, seconded by Mr. Hine, to approve a Douglas County liquor license as listed for a one-year term beginning May 1, 2019 and ending April 30th, 2020. Business name is 1003 Southline Inc., DBA to Carbon Steakhouse and Bar.
Discussion?
Where is this?
This is the former Proud Mary's location.
Okay. Yep.
Any other discussion? Roll call, please.
Mr. Mikeworth.
Yes.
Mr. Glenn.
Yes.
Mr. Hine.
Yes.
Mrs. Appleby.
Yes.
Mr. Hettinger,
Yes.
Mr. Morris,
Yes.
and Mr. Munson.
Yes. Mr. Mycor, would you present item 10?
Most certainly. Mr. Chairman, I move that the board adopt ordinance 19-0-5, establishing civil fees and criminal and traffic assessments to be charged by the clerk of the circuit clerk that will be effective July 1st, 2019, and that it be ordained by the county board of the county of Douglas, that Douglas County Resolution 09-R-18 that was effective January 1st, 2010 is hereby repealed in its entirety and placed with the new fees established in this ordinance as attached.
Second.
Second.
Mr. Hettinger.
There's a motion on the floor by Mr. Mycor, seconded by Mr. Hettinger, to adopt ordinance 19-0-5, establishing civil fees and criminal and traffic assessments to be charged by the clerk of the circuit court that will be effective July 1, 2019. And that it be ordained by the county board of the county of Douglas that the Douglas County Resolution 09-R-18 that was effective January 1, 2010 is hereby repealed in its entirety and replaced with the new fees established in this ordinance as attached.
Is there any discussion?
Is this all brought about by the state
Yes.
changing the legislation
Yes.
as I read? And then it goes into effect July 1st?
Yes.
Any amplification?
No, that's correct. This is supposed to be a uniform assessment of fees across the board on the entire state. So these are fees and amounts that we're stuck with.
Thank you, Kate. Any other discussion? Question? Roll call, please.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mr. Hine?
Yes.
Mrs. Appleby?
Yes.
Mr. Hettinger?
Yes.
Mr. Morris?
Yes.
Mr. Munson?
Yes.
And Mr. Mycor?
Yes.
Mr. Hine, would you present item 11?
Yes, sir, Mr. Chairman. I move that the preliminary engineering service agreement section 19-02127-00-BR be approved and submitted by the Engineering Resource Association and that the county board chairman be authorized to sign the agreement.
Second?
That's second.
Mr. Glenn?
There's a motion on the floor by Mr. Hine, seconded by Mr. Glenn, that the preliminary engineering services agreement, section 19-02127-00-BR, be approved as submitted by Engineering Resource Associates, and that the county board chairman be authorized to sign the agreement.
Discussion? Mr. Crane, do you have any?
No, just the bridge that we tried to repair was before the contractor went bankrupt, so the township's elected to fund their 50% to pay for the bridge, so.
This is that bridge west of Arcola.
Yeah, it's about 600 east, 575 east.
Right.
Just south of
Right.
Springfield Road, about
Right.
200 feet.
Is there any discussion? Roll call, please.
Mr. Hine?
Yes.
Mrs. Appleby?
Yes.
Mr. Hettinger?
Yes.
Mr. Morris?
Yes.
Mr. Munson?
Yes.
Mr. Mycor?
Yes.
And Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn, would you present item 12, please?
Mr. Chairman, I move that the amendment to extend and the affidavit to extend local agency documents extending the local agency agreement for state participation section 13-00106-00-PV job number P95-325-15, Cronus Chemical Infrastructure and Improvements to May 5th of 2022 be approved as submitted, and that the county board chairman be authorized to sign the agreement and affidavit.
Second,
Second.
Mr. Hahn.
There's a motion on the floor by Mr. Glenn, seconded by Mr. Hine, that the amendment to extend and the affidavit to extend local agency documents extending the local agency agreement for state participation, section 13-00106-00-PV, job number P95-325-15, Cronus Chemical Infrastructure Improvements, to May 5th, 2022, to be approved as submitted, and that the county board chairman be authorized to sign the agreement and affidavit.
Discussion or comments by Mr. Craig?
So this is basically a paperwork issue. The original agreements, they're agreements for state participation with the local agencies in the state of Illinois. If it's under $1 million projects, it's 3 years. If it's $1 million plus, it's 5 years. So since we've had scope creep to the $1 million mark in engineering fees, it's a 5-year, and that's set to expire. So this extends it out. So we still have that agreement still in place, and we're still able to get 100% reimbursement once we ask for it. So the other 4 agreements to be constructed have not been executed yet, so we don't have to worry about doing any of those, but those will be executed once the designs are ready to go and do construction. So this is just for engineering only.
Thank you, Jim. Any other questions or discussion?
Is there any update status on this?
Pardon me?
Is there any updated status on Cronus
Yes.
coming?
Mr. Crane, do you want to?
I defer to the face name.
Oh, Mr. Moody.
Sorry, Chairman.
Come in.
We did receive a positive update from the project principals last week. Nothing I can share publicly yet, but in the next couple weeks, we'll probably be putting out an update. So continue to make good progress forward, and hopefully we'll have much more substantial update here in the very near future. So with that.
Thank you. Any other question or comment? Roll call, please.
Mrs. Appleby?
Yes.
Mr. Henninger?
Yes.
Mr. Morris?
Yes.
Mr. Munson?
Yes.
Mr. Mikeworth?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
And Mr. Hine?
Yes.
Mr. Mikeworth, would you present item 13, please?
Most certainly. Mr. Chairman, I move the board approve resolution 19-R-8 adopting the updated Douglas County multi-jurisdictional all-hazard mitigation plan as the official hazard mitigation plan of Douglas County, and agree to participate in the annual and 5-year updates to this updated plan.
Is there a second?
Second.
Thanks. Mr. Morris.
There's a motion on the floor by Mr. Mikeworth, seconded by Mr. Morris, to approve Resolution 19-R-8, adopting the updated Douglas County multi-jurisdictional all-hazard mitigation plan as the official hazard mitigation plan of Douglas County, and agree to participate in the annual and 5-year updates to this updated plan.
Any discussion or questions? Roll call, please.
Mr. Henninger?
Yes.
Mr. Morris?
Yes.
Mr. Munson?
Yes.
Mr. Mikeworth?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mr. Hine?
Yes.
And Mrs. Appleby?
Yes.
Mr. Hediger, would you present item 14?
Mr. Chairman, I make a motion to approve Resolution 19-R-9, stating that the collective bargaining agreement between the County of Douglas, the Douglas County Sheriff, and the IFOP Labor Council for the deputy sheriffs in accordance with agreements between the parties, which are summarized in the attached document is hereby adopted. This collective bargaining agreement is effective January 1 of 19 and shall remain in full force and effect until December 31 of 2022.
This is the document. Makes good bedtime reading. Is there any, a second, I need a second. Mr. Hahn, very good. Is there any discussion or questions?
Everything is basically the same status-wise other than the salaries.
Yes. Yes. The salaries are consistent with what we were able to grant for our people here in the courthouse. And they increased to the final year at a 3% increase in that final year of 2022, which I considered to be frugal.
Yeah, they were, pretty easy to deal with.
Yes. So we're pleased with it.
Yes.
Yeah. Is there any other comments or questions? We'd have Sheriff Blackwell comment on it, but
He's not in the state.
he's not in the state, so we'll, roll call, please.
Okay. Mr. Morris?
Yes.
Mr. Munson?
Yes.
Mr. Micler?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mr. Hine?
Yes.
Mrs. Appleby?
Yes.
And Mr. Hedinger?
Yes.
And I'd like to thank Mr. Hedinger for being the board's representative on this bargaining committee, and there are still 2 agreements that need to be made, and they are in progress. So, is there any new business to be brought before the board? Is there any questions or comments from the press first? Nope. Are there any comments or questions from the audience? Dave?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just want to update everybody because we're working on that situation with EDP. And I talked to Kate Friday, I talked to Jim Friday, I talked to Dawn yesterday. And my first thought in waiting, I got the information kind of last week, the final piece of information, maybe hopefully get some more. But my thought up until I talked to Dawn, and we will do what the chairman asked us to do, was to try to work with the county board to have something tied in with your permit, because I understand being in the banking side of things that whoever your regulator, whoever controls your permit or your thing has a lot more control over the other factor than 2 different separate entities. But he would like for us to work directly with EDP, and I already had a meeting when I talked to him to visit with Mary yesterday, and so we have headed down that road. She's got to get a hold of her attorneys and talk to them about a few items. I think the biggest stumbling block probably, or the hardest thing that we're going to have to deal with, and we talked about it a lot yesterday, is the fact of they're saying that they're not going to do any interference with our radio wave. So to me, looking at it from my perspective, looking at it that we're in a capitalistic society, which means whoever's constructing it is going to do it in the cheapest version they can. I feel like, or Longview Capital feels like we need a penalty that will be sufficient enough that if they get into it, that they'll decide not to, even because I know she told me yesterday that there's one place where they're gonna cross it, and it's up there by the big power poles that go through, so they gotta take the crane down anyway there, so they're gonna take it down there. But as I was looking, and I haven't talked to Mary about that, if they happen to need to use there's 2 or 3 of them that are on the southeast side of the whole platform, they would have to go under that time too. And so we're working on it. It's a matter of, the way I look at it, and it isn't the way they're probably gonna look at it, so we'll have to just work it out, is that if they're not going to get into it and tell me they're not, and they've got all this study that they're not, they've got the plans that they're not, then the fine or the penalty that is written into the agreement shouldn't matter, because they're not gonna pay it anyway, unless they do something said they're not gonna do. And so, but we'll work that out. She said it'll be a week or so before her attorneys get back to her. And so we're working it out, is what I'm saying, and trying to do it the way the chairman wants, and I respect that, okay? And so all I ask is that, I will keep you informed, is that the only thing that I know that can be held over them is the permit. And so I'd like for us, and as I told you and I told her yesterday, we'll be expedient in working with her as fast as she can be with her attorney. We all know that takes time. So I will keep you informed, but that's kind of the road we're going down, okay? So I just wanted to give you an update. Thank you.
Dave,
Yes.
after talking with you, I just had 2 questions for you.
Okay, yes.
Number 1, how is the FCC involved with this?
Well, we have a licensed
Yeah, to
data
operate.
to operate in that
Your
area.
microwave
Correct,
system. Right.
correct. And probably the FCC doesn't matter as much as the FDIC, who is the regulator for the banks.
Yeah.
They're the ones that would really probably be nasty about it, because, right now in the state, if we ended up with, if they happened to get into it and we had a data breach, we got to notify everybody. If they got into our stream and we had a data breach,
Right.
and the problem there, we'd have to notify all of our customers. And, not that notifying all of your customers may cost a lot, but reputation and some of those things. And, who wants to be at a grocery store or someplace, and because our data streams get bothered or something, your ATM card doesn't work and you look like you didn't have enough money in the bank, but you might have more money than anybody else. It's some of that kind of stuff, and the loss or the problem with data that might happen.
Have you ever had that problem?
We've not. Except, here's when we have the problem. I'll just tell you when we have the problem, because that was the question Amy had. The only problem we've had is because our radio went down or something like that.
Okay.
A radio goes bad, the wind comes and might blow it, but we know that. We have people from Bloomington that come down and take care of that.
Yeah.
So, but we've never had a bird fly through it, we've never had an airplane fly through it and had any problem.
Yeah.
So we've had, I'm sure, things, but we've never had a crane that's full of iron that may block
Right.
a substantial amount of it that causes problems.
So this is line of sight,
Correct. And it's-
physical.
Yes, and it's about 100, it's over 100, and it's probably less than 150 feet above the ground.
Okay.
That's kind of the range of it.
Yeah.
Less than 200.
Just wanting to get it straight in my
Yeah,
head.
it's a line of sight. It's about 100 feet wide.
Yeah.
During a lot of the course of it, most of the data streams within a narrower spot than the 100 feet wide tunnel.
Okay.
So
Thank you.
that's what I know. Yeah, if you got any more, let me know,
Yeah.
okay?
Thank you. Are there any other comments or questions? If not, is there any need for an executive session? If not, Mr. Glenn, I will entertain your motion.
Mr. Chairman, I'd like to make a motion for adjournment to June 19th of 2019 at 9 o'clock in the morning.
Second, Mr. Morris. Discussion?
Yeah, the special meetings coming up, this doesn't affect.
The ones that the clerk sent out to us and that has official notification, those are the ones that are in effect. Yeah.
Okay, well, I just
But at this
wondered-
meeting, we just go from regular to regular.
That's fine.
Yes, that's correct. Good point. Any other discussion? Roll call, please.
There's a motion on the floor by Mr. Glenn, seconded by Mr. Morris, that there being no further business to come before the county board, to adjourn to June 19th, 2019 at 9 a.m. Mr. Munson?
Yes.
Mr. Michael?
Yes.
Mr. Glenn?
Yes.
Mr. Hine?
Yes.
Mrs. Appleby?
Yes.
Mr. Hettinger?
Yes.
And Mr. Morris?
Yes.
Meeting's adjourned.